I leaned against the counter, breathing heavily as blood pooled on the floor. My hands trembled, my knuckles were raw and aching, but I couldn't sit down yet. The kitchen was a mess, broken glass glinting under the harsh light, a chair overturned, and that bright ugly red staining the pristine white tiles in my sanctuary. It's a moment to reflect and savor the satisfaction of standing your ground. Violence isn't my first choice, but when a man disrespects you in your own home, you've got to remind him whose name is on the mortgage. It wasn't a bar fight or a random act of rage. It was a battle for dignity, respect, and the right to be treated like a doormat in my own home. I looked at his face, swollen and bloodied, with a gash above his brow that would leave a scar if he learned his lesson and lived long enough to care about scars. His teeth, what was left of them, were scattered across the floor like broken pearls. He walked in with a smug smile, thinking he could bare his teeth at me. I could hear her pacing the floorboards above me, but she hadn't come down yet. I'll admit a small part of me wished she had, maybe then I wouldn't have felt the full weight of her betrayal. You're probably wondering how he got here, how a peaceful law-abiding man like me ended up in a fist fight in his own kitchen. Grow up fighting. My father always said the strongest man in the room was the one who could walk away, and I believed that for a long time. But in some situations some people don't let you walk away, some people mistake your patience for weakness, your silence for fear, and tonight patience wasn't on the menu. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, each second punctuating the heavy silence. I grabbed a towel, crouching to clean up the blood. The motion felt mechanical. Events that led to this moment, every insult, every smirk, every audacious word that left his mouth, how he strutted into my house like he owned it, like I was just some insignificant obstacle in his way. But here's the thing about obstacles, some don't move, some hit back. As I scrubbed the floor, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had fueled me earlier had simmered down, leaving behind a cold hard clarity. Peace. My home. I stood up, tossing the towel into the sink, and looked around the kitchen. It was still a mess, but it was my mess and my space, and as for him, let's just say he won't be coming back here anytime soon. This was just the beginning of the story, but even then I knew one thing for sure: some people need to learn the hard way. Notice the cracks until they became impossible to ignore. It started subtly, little things I could have easily missed if I hadn't been paying attention. Her phone used to sit on the counter while we ate dinner. Now it was glued to her hand, face down, and on silent. At first I thought it was work, maybe a stressful deadline or a client needing her attention, but it wasn't just work. I'd walk into the room and she'd stop texting mid-sentence, her thumb coming home later with vague excuses about traffic or last-minute errands. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband who saw ghosts where there weren't, so I let it slide. Trust was the foundation of any good marriage. But trust doesn't mean blind stupidity. One night I decided to ask her outright. She had been unusually distant that evening, and the tension between us felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Is something wrong? I asked, keeping my tone. Been different, distant. Is there something I should know? For a moment she looked at me like she wanted to say something, like the truth was bubbling just beneath the surface, but then she shrugged, plastering on a fake smile. You're imagining things. That word hung in the air like a bad smell. I knew better, but I let it drop for the moment. A week later I found out I wasn't imagining things after all. She came home late that evening, her hair tousled, her lipstick bag on the counter, and avoided looking at me. Can we talk? She said, her voice hesitant. Of course, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She took a deep breath, as though bracing herself. Did I've met someone? I stared at her, the words hanging in the air like a slap to the face. You've met someone? I repeated, incredulous. It's not what you think, she said quickly. I didn't mean for it to happen, it just did. That was the moment something inside me makes you question your own reality. I stared at the woman I'd shared my life with, wondering how we got here. And you felt it was appropriate to bring this up now? I asked, my voice calm but cold. She fidgeted with her hands, avoiding my gaze. I think we need to talk about us and where this is going. I didn't have an answer. I nodded and left the room. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. The next morning I woke up with a resolve. Another thing came, but I didn't know how bold her new boyfriend would be. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the living room trying to read a book I wasn't reading. The house was quiet, so the sound of a car pulling into the driveway felt like a siren. I peeked through the curtains and saw him. He stepped out of the car like he owned the place. Front door. I didn't need an introduction to know who he was. The way he walked, swaggering, confident, and arrogant, told me everything. She came in first, holding the door open for him like a hostess welcoming a VIP guest. Darling, she said, her voice strained and overly cheerful. This is John. John, the name hung in the air like a challenge. He walked in, slowly, taking my time. I wanted him to feel my weight of gaze. John the first, said, my voice steady. Nice to meet you. But he didn't shake my hand. Instead he stuffed his hands in his pockets and tilted his head, looking me up and down like he was sizing me up. You must be the husband, he said, grinning like it was a joke. Last I checked, I replied, keeping my tone. Even the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My wife shifted uncomfortably, spreading his arms across the cushions and looking at me with that same smug smile. He began, I figured it was about time we met. After all, it's a bit awkward, don't you think? Me and her, and you. I clenched my fists, but I kept my composure. Awkward isn't the word I'd use, I said. He laughed, a short mocking sound that made my blood boil. Relax, man, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just thought we could clear the air. Like I'm the intruder. That's clear. He didn't like that. His grin faltered for a split second before he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and said, let's not make this harder than it has to be. I'm here now, things are changing, and you can accept it or not. It took everything in me not to laugh in his face at the audacity of this man walking into my home and acting like he had the upper hand. I'll keep that in mind, I said, my voice as calm as I could, but inside I was anything but calm. He leaned back again, looking around the room with that same condescending smirk. You've done all right for yourself, haven't you? Nice little setup here, I guess. She liked the stability. I didn't respond, I just stared at. After a few more minutes of posturing and veiled insults, he got up and stretched like he was bored. Well, he said, looking at my wife, this was fun, but we should probably get going. She avoided my gaze, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. I'll just grab my bag, she said, hurrying out of the room. That left me alone with him. He looked at me again, that smug smile returning. You're a patient guy, he said. I respect that, but patience only gets you so far. Gave me a mock salute. See you around, buddy, and just like that he was gone. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't angry yet, no, anger would come later. Right now all I felt was cold determination, because one thing was certain: the next time John set foot in my house things would end very differently. I should have known he'd come back. Guys like John always do. They thrive on the sound of their own voice and the smell of someone else's feet. Here he probably existence was a gift I should be grateful for. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock at the door, not a polite knock either, loud and impatient, the kind that demands attention. I opened it, and there he was, leaning casually against the door frame with that same infuriating smirk. Hope you don't mind me stopping by, he said, brushing past me. Before I could answer, I didn't mind yet, but I knew I was about to. He made himself at home, walking straight. John was already rummaging through my fridge. You've got good taste in beer, he said, pulling out a bottle and cracking it open on the edge of the counter like a caveman. The cap flew off, landing on the floor. He didn't even bother to pick it up. I followed him into the kitchen, leaning against the doorway and crossing my arms. Is there a reason? The back of his hand. Yeah, he said casually. We need to talk, Manto Man. I glanced at my wife, who looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. About what? I asked, my voice calm but firm. About her, he said, nodding toward my wife like she was some sort of prize he'd won. And about you, the way he said it so condescendingly, so mug, made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. I wasn't about to let him see me lose control. John stepped closer, closing the space. Hard watching a guy like me come in and take over, but hey, life's not fair, right? I said, my voice as cold as steel. He smirked, taking my calm for submission. See, I knew you'd understand, and I appreciate that, really I do, but here's the thing: this house, it doesn't really feel like it belongs to you anymore, you know? That means this house, this life, it's mine too. I stared at him, letting his words sink in. He was close now, too close to smell the arrogance on him. And what happens? I asked slowly. If I don't agree, John chuckled, setting the beer bottle down on the counter with a loud clink. Then maybe I'll have to convince you. He pushed me, not hard, but enough to make his point, enough to show me he wasn't joking. I didn't move. He pushed me harder this time. What's line had been crossed, and there was no going back. I stepped forward, closing the gap between us until we were nose to nose. My voice was quiet and controlled. You've got about 3 seconds to get out of my house, I said, or this is going to end badly for or meek husband, a pushover who'd step aside and let someone else waltz in and take everything. But here's the thing about guys like him: they've never met someone like me. It happened fast. I grabbed the beer bottle he'd so carelessly placed on my counter and smashed it to the floor. The sound startled him, his smirk faltering for the first time. Towering over him. You think this is a game? I asked, my voice low and cold. He pushed himself off the counter, his bravado returning. Big talk for a guy who hasn't thrown a punch yet, he sneered, swinging wildly at me. Rookie mistake. I ducked easily, stepping inside his reach and landing a solid punch to his rib. He doubled over with a grunt, and I didn't let up. I replied, advancing on him, and he swung again, catching my shoulder, but it was weak and desperate. I grabbed his arm and twisted, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the kitchen island. He hit the edge hard and collapsed onto the floor with a groan. I stood over him, breathing heavily. Thing about being an alpha, I said, ice cold. It's not about who can shout the loudest or act the toughest, it's about knowing when you've lost. I grabbed him by the collar and hauled him to his feet. He swayed unsteadily, blood dripping from his split lip and broken teeth. You're done, I said, shoving him toward the door. Get out of my house and don't ever come back. But John, stubborn and stupid, wasn't ready to quit. He lunged at me with a nearby pan and cracking it against the side of his head, he crumpled to the floor like a sack of bricks, groaning in pain. This time, I crouched beside him to make sure he could hear every word. You're lucky I have restraint, I said, because if it were up to me, you wouldn't be walking out of here. I grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the door, his protests weak and slurred, blood smeared across the floor. Bruises, this isn't over, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Oh, it's over, I replied, stepping back inside and slamming the door behind me. The silence that followed was deafening. My hands were shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins, but I felt a strange sense of calm. I stood my ground, I defended my home. I turned back to the kitchen, surveying the mess. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that seemed to echo through the entire house. Outside, I could hear John groaning, probably trying to pick himself up off the porch. Good luck with that. I didn't care what happened to him after he left my property, as long as he never came back. I leaned against the door, catching my breath. The adrenaline was still surging through my veins, leaving me shaky, but oddly focused. My knuckles throbbed, the skin split. It felt right. The kitchen was a disaster zone. Blood streaked across the floor, broken glass glittering under the overhead light. The chair he'd knocked over lay on its side, one of its legs bent at an awkward angle. The beer bottle he'd smashed earlier had left a jagged dent in the counter. It was chaos, pure and simple, but it was my chaos. I started cleaning up, grabbing a roll of paper towels and a bucket of soapy water. Each swipe felt like a small victory. John, no one was going to take that from me. As I worked, I kept replaying the fight, the insults, and the look of shock on his face when he realized I wasn't the pushover he thought I was. There's something satisfying about watching arrogance crumble. He'd come into my house full of swagger and bravado thinking he could intimidate me, but he was the one crawling away bloodied and broke. Tired my wife hadn't come downstairs. I could hear her footsteps above me pacing back and forth. She was probably in shock, unsure of what to do or say. I didn't care. She'd made her choices and now she'd have to live with the consequences. As I scrubbed the last of the blood off the floor, I felt a strange sense of calm. The storm had passed, and I was still standing when I threw the dirty rags into the trash. I poured myself a glass of water and I drew a line in the sand and wasn't about to back down. John had learned his lesson the hard way. He strutted into my house like a lion baring his teeth, only to leave as a battered cub licking his wounds. I smirked at the "What happened to you, man?" they'd ask, and he'd have to admit he got his teeth knocked out by the husband of the woman he thought he could steal. Poetic justice. If you ask me, the house was quiet now save for the occasional creak of floorboards above. The mess was cleaned up, the kitchen back in order, but the tension lingered heavy and oppressive. I knew the fight with John wasn't the end of it. There was still the matter of my wife. I stared at the EMP. Betrayed you so completely. How do you even begin to unravel the mess they've made of your life? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same man I'd been a few hours ago. I'd stood my ground, defended my home, and proved that I wasn't to be underestimated. As for John, well, let's just say he won't be drinking solid food anytime soon. I could hear her upstairs pacing like a time bomb, so I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath my feet punctuating the tension in the air. My knuckles still throbbed, and the adrenaline that had carried me through the fight was long gone, replaced by a colder resolve. When I opened the bedroom door, she stopped pacing and looked at me for the first time in years. I let the door swing shut behind me. Do what? Defend myself, defend my home. Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't respond. What were you expecting exactly? I asked, keeping my voice calm. Did you think I'd roll out the red carpet for him, invite him to stay for dinner, let him parade around my house like he owns it? Yes. The only thing keeping her grounded. I didn't think it would come to this. Then you weren't thinking at all. Her head snapped up at that, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. I interrupted to explain why you thought it was a good idea to bring him here to our home. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the words sticking in her throat. I gave her a moment, but when the silence stretched on, I stepped closer. Do is tell me why. She stared at the floor, her voice trembling when she finally spoke. I didn't mean for it to happen. I barked out a harsh and humorless laugh. I didn't mean for what to happen, the affair, the disrespect, or inviting him into my house to gloat about it. Her head shot up again, and this time there were tears in her eyes. I didn't know he'd act like that, she whispered. I thought he just wanted to talk, and you believed him. I shook my head incredulously. You're smarter than that, or at least I thought you were. Her tears spilled over, but I didn't feel sympathy this time. I'd given her my trust, love, and loyalty, and she'd thrown it away for a man who couldn't even hold his own in a fight. Made choices that disrespected me, our marriage, and everything we built together. She sobbed harder, but I didn't move to comfort her. This wasn't my mess to clean up anymore, and you're going to have to live with those choices, I said, my voice steady, because I'm done. I've given you every chance and ounce of forgiveness I had in me. But let me be clear, this is my house, my life, and if you or anyone else thinks they can walk in here and take that away from me, you're wrong. I turned and walked out, leaving her to grapple with the wreckage of her own decisions. I walked out of that room, leaving her broken and lost. I didn't slam the door, I didn't shout or scream, no dramatic gestures my style, but in my heart I knew something irreversible had just happened. It was over for too long. Fixed, that whatever cracks had formed in our marriage could be patched up with time and effort, but tonight had ripped those cracks wide open. Reveal. The truth beneath, trust shattered, loyalty abandoned, respect non-existent. I stood in the hallway staring at nothing in particular, letting the weight of it all settle over me. The house was silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath. Downstairs, needing space to think, the kitchen was clean, the blood stains scrubbed away, the glass swept up. The physical mess was gone, but the emotional mess lingered thick and suffocating. I poured myself a drink, not alcohol, just water, and sat at the kitchen table staring into the glass like it held answers. It didn't, but it gave me something to focus on while my mind raced to rebuild. Yourself. For years I'd been living for us, for her. Every decision I made, every step I took had been with our life together in mind, but now it was time to focus on me. I thought about the man I'd been when we first met, confident, ambitious, unshakable. Somewhere along the way that man had gotten lost, buried under the weight of compromise and routine. I didn't resent her for that, it was part of life and love, but now that love was gone and it was time to find. Glanced at the screen, a text from an old friend I hadn't seen in years. Hey man, long time no see, let's catch up soon. I stared at the message for a moment before replying, Leighton, do it, I'll call you tomorrow. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. Reconnecting with the people and things I'd neglected was the first step toward reclaiming my life. As I sat there, the events of the evening played over in my mind like a movie. Choices, the silence that followed it all, heavy and unrelenting. I didn't feel regret for the fight, the confrontation, or standing up for myself. I felt a strange sense of peace. John was a painful, humiliating lesson for both of us. For him, it was a reminder that arrogance and bravado only get you so far. For her, it was a wake-up call. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of starting over, rebuilding, rediscovering who I was and what I wanted. As I headed upstairs to grab a fresh set of clothes, I paused at the foot of the staircase looking up at the closed bedroom door. "I hope you figure things out," I said quietly, not expecting an answer, and then I walked away. I didn't go out of my way to check on her because the distance wasn't just physical but emotional, a canyon too wide to bridge. I focused on myself piece by piece, like rebuilding a house after a storm. The first step was reconnecting with friends and hobbies I'd neglected. I went back to the gym not out of vanity but to feel strong again. Found peace in my own company, but her regret was a storm brewing on its own. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house filled with the kind of quiet that only comes at dusk, she came downstairs. I was in the living room with a book open in my lap, though I wasn't really reading. She stood there hesitating in the doorway, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative. I looked. "I made a mistake," she began, her voice trembling. "I let my selfishness ruin everything, and I don't know how to fix it." Her words hung in the air but didn't touch me. She flinched, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she sank into the chair across from me, looking at me like she was searching for some sign of the man she once knew. That would have rushed to comfort her was gone. She'd killed it little by little with every lie, betrayal, and choice she made to put someone else above me. "You can't fix it," I said simply. "Some things can't be undone." Tears welled up in her eyes and she shook her head as if denying my words would make them less true. I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't realize what I had, what I was throwing away. I thought he was different, and now you. "I miss us," she said between sobs. "I miss the life we had. I miss you." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "The life we had is gone, and the person you miss is gone too. You can't expect to burn down a house and still want to live in it." "Anything." I shook my head, standing up. "It's not about what you'll do now, it's about what you've already done." She stayed in the chair, her shoulders slumped, the weight of regret pressing down on her, but I didn't feel the need to stay and watch. I'd said my piece, and I wasn't interested in rehashing the past. As I left the room, I heard her whisper something faint and broken. "I'm sorry, but sorry doesn't build trust, sorry doesn't erase betrayal, and sorry." After John and the fight, there was a peaceful silence that felt like a deep breath after a storm. She had left 2 days earlier, her bags packed, her face strewn with tears, but no argument this time, just silence and the weight of inevitability. I didn't stop her, I didn't beg her to stay, or make promises I couldn't keep. Gone, leaving empty spaces that somehow made the house feel larger and lighter. I rearranged the furniture, repainted the walls, and replaced the bed linens with ones I liked. My last project was the kitchen, which I scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, placed the dented counter, and bought new chairs for the table. This was my space now, and I wanted it to feel like mine. The second day, I stood at the front door and looked out at Head. He thought he was the lion, but he left as nothing more than a toothless cub. I wondered if he'd learned his lesson, if he'd looked in the mirror and realized that arrogance and bravado were no substitute for respect and honor. Probably not. Guys like him rarely do. As for me, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is exhausting, and I didn't have the energy to carry it around. What I felt now was something more profound, clarity I'd spent years bending over backward to make others. The text from my friend buzzed on my phone again. "Dinner tomorrow, my treat." I smiled and typed back, looking forward to it. Rebuilding my life wasn't going to happen overnight. To focus on myself, to figure out who I was and what I wanted. As I sat on the couch with a fresh cup of coffee in hand and thought about the future. Not the painful, complicated mess I'd left behind, but the clean slate in front of me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't looking back. Bare his teeth at someone, he'd have to remember what it was like to lose a few. I leaned back and let the serenity wash over me. The storm had passed, and I was standing for the first time in a long time. I felt free. If you think the story is interesting, please subscribe and leave a comment. Number 1. If not, please leave a comment. Number 2, so I can make the required adjustments. As if it were yesterday, I can still clearly recall the night she left, like a cruel rerun that I can't turn off. The memory replays itself in my mind at home. It was supposed to be a calm Friday night. It felt different that night, even though we had been fighting intermittently for weeks. Nothing serious, just minor rifts that appear in any relationship after years of dating. When I spoke, she was fidgeting, glancing at her phone, and then she brought up the party that a friend of a friend was throwing. I was not invited, but it was one of those sort of familiar social gatherings that she enjoyed taking me to, which I detested because they made me feel alienated. That ought to have been my first warning sign. I told her that I didn't think it was a good idea because it didn't seem like the right time for her to be out drinking and having a good time, not just because I wasn't going. I wanted to mend whatever was causing our relationship to deteriorate, but she dismissed me, saying I was exaggerating, as if my worries were more about my own ego than about us. She accused me of being insecure and domineering. That might have had some truth to it. It wasn't just the door she shut behind her. I'm not sure. When she left, she seemed to have cut me out of her life, if only for the night. So I took action. I ignored her being immature and petty. I didn't text her to see if she was home or to check in. She made a few attempts to get in touch, sending me a photo of herself at the party, grinning and having a good time with a group of people I didn't know. The text said smiley face. I didn't respond. A part of me said, okay, let her feel single if she wants to act that way. The hours passed slowly. Midnight arrived and passed. I tried not to think about the worst as I lay in bed, aimlessly scrolling through my phone, but it was 1 a.m. I let my imagination run wild as the clock struck 2. Am with whom was she? What was she doing? Did my presence at home even bother her? By morning, I was still awake, restless and wallowing in my own nervousness, and I was upset with her as well as with myself for being so concerned. When she came back, I was pacing the living room practicing the fight I knew we were going to have. She arrived at my doorstep instead of entering through the door. I didn't anticipate that not even her keys were with her. She was standing there when I opened the door, her hair in disarray and makeup smudged as if she hadn't slept either. At first she remained silent, but her eyes were red as if she had been crying. After a long moment of silence, she muttered, "Can we talk?" I knew something had happened, but I wasn't prepared to hear it. It wasn't just her appearance that made me nervous, it was also the way she avoided my gaze and the way her body drooped as if the entire world had suddenly fallen on her. Although I still question whether I could have done something differently or said something to get her to stay at home that evening. The truth is that whatever was on the verge of her speaking, and whatever had already occurred, didn't start at that party. This was the result of larger cracks that had been developing for a long time before either of us realized it. It wasn't until it was too late that morning that I realized how wide they had gotten. Was the start of the end, even though I wasn't aware of it at the time, or perhaps I was, but I wasn't prepared to acknowledge it. She appeared so frail and tiny when she entered. My wife, the person I had spent years establishing a life with and whom I believed I knew better than anyone else, suddenly seemed unfamiliar to me. She was gripping the strap of her purse with trembling hands, and I could see the hesitation in every step she took. She just stood there staring at the floor as if it would swallow her whole. When I asked her what had happened, I didn't want to sit down, but she asked in a barely audible voice, and we sat down. I didn't want to be comfortable for whatever was coming, but I nodded and we headed for the couch. Perched as if she were about to run, she sat at the farthest edge. There was a lot of tension and unspoken truth in the air between us. As I waited for her to speak, my stomach roiled. The silence was finally broken by her. I'm at a loss for words. My chest was thumping with my heart. I snapped more harshly than I meant to, so just say it. She winced and tears welled up in her eyes. Last night something occurred. I kissed someone, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was struck by the fact that she started crying. Have you kissed anyone? I had a hard time processing what she had just said. I was initially incredulous. This had been done by my wife, who had always taken pride in her loyalty and had reprimanded friends for even flirting outside of marriage. Like a tidal wave, I could feel my anger rising. Did you give someone a kiss? I said it again, louder this time. How on earth does that mean anything? Who? Why? She was now crying and using the back of her hand to wipe her face. It was foolish. She choked. There was this guy and I was drinking. He simply existed. I don't know what I was thinking, but he was being kind to me. I promise it meant nothing. It had no significance. God, I detested that expression. She could have just as easily stabbed me in the chest. How could it be meaningless when kissing someone else meant so much to me? How could it be pointless? I was unable to stop myself. What else took place? My voice trembled as I asked. No matter how much it might hurt her, I had to know. Silence was a powerful tool, she whispered. I stopped it before it went any further. As her head fell, I promise I will put a stop to it. I wished to believe her. I really wanted to think that this kiss was the last straw, that she had not betrayed me further, but something about her attitude, the fact that she was unable to look me in the eye, made me uneasy. Then it dawned on me that she was only telling me this because she was worried that I might hear it from someone else. Who was it? I asked sharply, and she replied quickly, "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." Quickly I yelled, losing all composure. The trust that we had built over the years was suddenly disintegrating, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. She paused, and I thought she might not tell me, but then she let out a defeated sigh. She said it was one of Sarah's friends at the party. She was dragged to that goddamn party by her friend Sarah, with whom she always hung out. My hatred for myself was greater than my hatred for her, the party, the guy, and even my wife. She had been out there doing this while I had been sitting at home, ignoring her, believing that I was teaching her a lesson. I couldn't sit still any longer, so I got up suddenly. I muttered as I made my way to the door, "I need some air." With a desperate tone she begged, "Please don't go. I sincerely apologize for my error. I love you, but I'm not sure why I did it. I'd rather not lose you." As I left, her words continued to reverberate in my ears. I knew I couldn't be in that house, couldn't sit next to her while she cried and pleaded, but I had no idea where I was going for pardon. Every argument, every moment of uncertainty, and every clue I might have missed were all replayed in my racing mind. Was I to blame for this? Did I force her to do this? I wandered around the neighborhood for hours, mentally reliving her confession. A part of me wanted to go back and hold her, to tell her that we would work things out, but another part of me wanted to pack up and never look back because I felt betrayed and broken. It was dark when I got back home. Her eyes were red and her face was pale as she remained seated on the couch and swollen. She gave me a hopeful look, but I was unable to speak. I simply walked past her and shut the door behind me. As I went to bed that night, I didn't get any sleep. I had the uneasy feeling that this was just the beginning of the unraveling, and the woman on the other side of the wall felt like a stranger. Some of the most agonizing days of my life were those that followed. I made an effort to keep us apart, but it was impossible to share a home and not feel the oppressive weight of her betrayal weighing down on every conversation. I wasn't prepared to hear her apologize, but she persisted in trying. I always thought of her with him, some anonymous stranger at that party who had stolen a part of her that should have been mine. The questions that followed the betrayal were even worse than the actual betrayal. Was she being completely honest with me? Was it just a kiss? Really, she did it, but why did she think this was acceptable? Because of something about me, about us. My mind was a battlefield. All the time I stayed away from her as much as possible, alternating between heartbreak, anger, and self-doubt. I would arrive at work early, return home late, and make up reasons to go out on the weekends, but the thoughts would follow me everywhere. I began to out everything, every argument we had ever had, every instance in which I had witnessed her texting someone while wearing a faint smile, and every evening when she had arrived home a bit later than usual. Had she been caught before, or was this the first time? And she saw. Of course she took a seat across from me at the dining table one evening, while I was figging to browse through my phone. I didn't raise my eyes. "Will you ever speak to me again?" softly she inquired. She sounded as though she was choking back tears in the same way that she had left me sitting in my own misery that night. I wanted to ignore her and let her sit in the silence, but I was unable to do so. After setting my phone aside, I turned to face her. "What should I say in your opinion?" I asked bluntly. Unexpectedly, she blinked. "All I want is for us to resolve this. I am aware that I made a mistake. I am aware of my pain, but I want us to continue working through this because I love you." I gave a sour laugh. "How am I supposed to simply move on from the fact that you kissed another man that you?" Before I could finish, my voice broke. She broke down in tears which trickled silently down her cheeks. "I don't think you'll move on," she said. I want you to know how sorry I am. I despise myself for it. I've been trying to understand why I did it, and I believe that I've been unhappy for a while." She paused, inhaling deeply. I was gut-stricken by what she said. "Punch," I said again. "Unhappy is my fault now." Rising. "No," she said hastily. "I'm not saying that at all. I simply believe that we have both been unhappy. We've been aloof and constantly at odds. I suppose I was searching for tension, or some sort of validation, because I felt lonely. It was the worst thing I've ever done, and I wasn't thinking straight." Her remarks felt like a kick to the face. I was aware that our relationship had not always been ideal, but I had never considered turning to someone else for solace. I had never even considered it. I thought bitterly. "That's what separates us," I said in a sarcastic tone. "You were lonely. Do you realize how alone I felt when you left the party that night while you were there to validate me?" I didn't care that she winced at what I said, even if only briefly. I wanted her to know how much she had hurt me. We sat for a long time in silence. "I want to go to therapy for us, please," she whispered at the end. "I'll do anything." I couldn't bring myself to agree, but her plea hung in the air. It was like applying a bandage to a gunshot wound. I wasn't sure if the harm could ever be reversed because it had already been done. I slept on the couch that night. As I lay there looking at the ceiling, I realized something that scared me. I wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. The weeks that followed were a haze of pathetic attempts to make amends. We increased our conversation, but it felt like a minefield. Every time I kept questioning myself, and she was walking on eggshells, trying desperately to show that she was sorry. Every word she spoke made me question whether I was clinging to her out of love for her, or out of fear of losing her. There were more rifts between us than before, and for the first time I began to question whether they could ever be healed, or if leaving was the only option. Life isn't that simple, is it? I wish I could say that there was a clear turning point after that I had a sudden epiphany and knew what I needed to do. Not a single moment was when I knew if I wanted to leave or fight for my marriage. In my mind, every day was a new battleground where my pride and my heart were pulling me in different directions. We attended therapy. I consented because I wanted answers. Answers she couldn't provide me on her own, not because I believed it would make things better. Sitting across from her in that room, saying things I'd never said aloud and hearing things I didn't want to hear, made the sessions difficult. Honest and emotional. Tearing open a wound that had just begun to scab over was the sensation. During one of the first sessions, the therapist said something that really stuck with me. According to her, unfulfilled needs, loneliness, or feelings of inadequacy are frequently the reasons behind cheating. But that doesn't make it acceptable. I didn't feel any better after hearing that. On the contrary, it made me feel worse, since it made me face the unpleasant reality that our marriage wasn't as strong as I had believed. Her subtle withdrawal, our arguments about things I considered unimportant, and the way I occasionally cut her off when she tried to express her feelings that I wasn't accountable for her actions were some of the problems that I had overlooked for years. But I wasn't blameless in the rifts that had developed between us either. During those sessions, she opened up in unexpected ways. She acknowledged that she had been craving love and attention that she didn't think she was receiving from me, and that she had been feeling lost and invisible. One day, with tears in her eyes, she said, "I felt like you didn't see me anymore, and I felt guilty for wanting someone else to notice me." I was devastated by those words because they made me confront the fact that I hadn't seen her, which I had been avoiding. I stopped paying attention to the small details along the way, like how she changed her hair, the book she kept on her nightstand, and how her laugh had become softer with time. I neglected to show her that I still loved her because I was too preoccupied with being a good provider and maintaining the house. Even though I acknowledged my role in our issues, it didn't take away from what she had done, because I had been so preoccupied with my idea of what a husband ought to be that I had failed to see what she needed from me. The wound of her betrayal still lingered between us. I kept thinking about that night, the party, the guy, the kiss. No matter how many times she apologized or how much she cried every time she left the house without me, I wondered if she was telling the truth, or if there was more she was keeping from me. I had 100 scenarios in my mind, each one worse than the last. It felt impossible to regain the trust that had been lost. She made an effort. She tried. My goodness, she stopped going out with friends, erased her social media accounts, and gave me complete access to her phone. She was prepared to go to any lengths to demonstrate her commitment to making things right, but despite everything she did I was unable to get rid of the doubt, the paranoia and the anger and long simmering resentment. It was about how her actions had destroyed the foundation of our life together, how she had taken something sacred and tainted it, and how she had made me re-evaluate everything I believed to be true about her, us and myself. It was no longer just about the kiss. I began to question whether staying would just make things worse. Were we just two people holding on to a broken thing because we were afraid of starting over, or could we ever truly move past this? After yet another tense dinner in which we both skirted the subject, I finally voiced the thought that had been bothering me for weeks. What if we are unable to resolve this? Halfway to her mouth, she froze her fork. What are you saying? What if this is too much? Really? What if despite our best efforts we are unable to return to our previous state? Her eyes filled with tears. She muttered, I don't want to give up on us. I agree, but I'm not sure if I can forgive you. And even if I can, I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to trust you again. Then there was silence in the room. Neither of us wanted to speak the truth aloud, even though we both knew it. We decided to split up. A few weeks later the breakup was quiet, almost numb, rather than dramatic and furious. As she packed her belongings she sobbed, and I experienced an inexplicable hollow ache. It was like losing a limb. When I watched her leave, I had relied on her for so long, and believed I couldn't survive without it. 6 months have passed since her departure. I'm surviving, but I won't pretend that I'm fine. There are days when I feel a strange sense of relief, as if a burden has been lifted, and other days when I miss her so much that it hurts. The loneliness is real, but I've also begun to rediscover aspects of myself that I had forgotten, like friends I hadn't seen in years and hobbies I'd given up. I still wake up in the middle of the night and reach for her only to discover the bed is empty. Our story didn't end at that party. It ended in all the little moments before and after the cracks we ignored, the decisions we made, and the love we couldn't quite hold on to. I'm not sure if I'll ever fully recover from this, and I'm not sure if she will either. As painful as it is to acknowledge, I'm learning to live with the fact that love isn't always enough.